I moved into the apartment on a Monday, right before sunset. The place was small but comfortable, tucked away on the top floor of an aging brick building. The windows overlooked the neighboring rooftops, where pigeons gathered on rusting vents and the occasional cat slinked between chimneys. It wasn't anything special, but it was mine. The first night passed in a silence that felt unnatural. Cities always carried a low hum, distant traffic, the muffled wail of sirens, neighbors moving behind paper-thin walls. But this building, despite its age, felt still. The kind of stillness that wasn't peaceful, just waiting. I chalked it up to the exhaustion of moving. By the time my head hit the pillow, I was too tired to care about the weight of that silence pressing in from all sides. It didn't last. By the third night, I started noticing sounds. At first, they were easy to explain, old pipes groaning as they expanded and contracted, the settling of ancient wooden beams. But then came the tapping, a soft, deliberate rhythm that seemed to drift along the walls, moving. Not the erratic clatter of pipes or the hollow snap of wood, but something else entirely. I told myself it was the neighbors, someone up late, idly knocking against a wall as they scrolled on their phone or drummed their fingers while lost in thought. But I had no neighbors. The unit to my left was vacant. The one across the hall had a thick layer of dust on the doorknob, as if no one had touched it in weeks. The only other occupied unit on this floor was at the far end of the hall, separated from mine by two empty apartments. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing. The human mind was prone to tricks in the dark. When you're alone, you start noticing things you'd ignore otherwise. The faintest creak becomes a footstep. The rustle of fabric shifts into the whisper of unseen movement. I kept the lights on that night longer than usual, forcing myself to drown the anxiety with the glow of my laptop screen. Morning arrived with an odd discovery. As I brushed my teeth, I noticed the bathroom mirror looked off, tilted just slightly. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to catch my attention. I swore I had left it straight the night before. A trick of the eye, maybe, the mind playing games. I adjusted it back into place, ignored the prickling unease curling at the base of my skull, and went about my day. Then there was the smell. At first, it was faint, a musky, stale odor barely noticeable beneath the scent of my candles and laundry detergent. I thought it was coming from outside, maybe drifting in through the windows from the alley below. But as the days passed, it grew stronger. Thick, clinging. No matter how often I aired out the apartment, it remained. Some nights, I woke up with the sensation that it was heavier, like someone had been in my room, lingering. The smell was worse near my bed, where it felt like it had seeped into the walls themselves. I kept telling myself it was nothing. That paranoia was curling its fingers around me, stretching shadows where there were none. But then I found the hole. I noticed it one night as I climbed into bed, my fingers brushing against something rough along the wall, just beside my nightstand. A small, circular opening no bigger than the width of a pencil. It was cleanly drilled, the edges smooth. I leaned in, peering inside, but it was nothing but darkness. Just another imperfection in an old building. Maybe from a cable that had once run through here, or a botched attempt at mounting something. That's what I told myself. Still, curiosity gnawed at me. That night, I fetched a small flashlight and aimed the beam into the hole. At first, I saw nothing but empty space. The light barely reached beyond the wall, illuminating what looked like another hollow cavity, perhaps an old maintenance shaft or a forgotten crawl space between apartments. And then something moved. It was small, a shift in the darkness, a flicker like fabric shifting. I jerked the flashlight away, heart slamming against my ribs. My skin turned cold, a deep instinctual fear washing over me in waves. But when I forced myself to look again, the hole showed nothing but blackness. I barely slept that night. Lying in bed, I listened, not just to the tapping now, but to something else, something slower, the sound of breathing, faint, deliberate, just beyond the wall. The noises didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent. What had once been an occasional tap or creak in the dead of night was now something constant, something deliberate. Soft scratches along the walls, like nails dragging over wood. Shuffling sounds that moved through the apartment, always just behind her, always just out of sight. At first, she convinced herself it was mice. It had to be. The building was old, and old buildings had pests. But no matter how much she tried to rationalize, a sinking feeling nestled in her chest, a certainty that whatever was making those sounds was too large to be a rat. And it wasn't just at night anymore. The first time she heard it during the day, she was sitting at her desk, scrolling absently through her laptop, trying to focus on anything other than the gnawing unease. The sound came from the wall to her left, soft at first, a faint rustling, then something heavier, like weight shifting behind the drywall. It was a slow, dragging noise, something moving through the hollow spaces of the apartment. She sat frozen, staring at the wall, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She waited for the sound to stop, for her brain to piece together some logical explanation. Maybe a neighbor on the other side? Maybe the plumbing? But it was neither of those things. She knew that now, because it was coming from inside the walls. The paranoia settled in like a sickness. She began taking note of everything in the apartment, cataloging small details in the back of her mind, as if afraid something would change. Every night, before bed, she meticulously arranged the objects on her kitchen counter. The dish rack, the salt and pepper shakers, a glass she always left beside the sink. If something was off, she'd know. And soon something was. One night, she woke up with a start. Not because of a noise, but because of the absence of one. A silence so thick it felt unnatural, like the air itself was waiting, anticipating something. Her skin was damp with sweat, her breath coming shallow. It took her a few seconds to realize what had felt wrong. The apartment had changed. The chair at her dining table had been pulled out just slightly, a few inches from where it had been the night before. The throw blanket on the couch had shifted, as if someone had sat beneath it, their weight pressing it into new folds. And the glass she had left on the counter was no longer there. It was in the sink. She hadn't put it there. Her heart pounded against her ribs, every nerve in her body screaming for her to run. But she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she stood frozen in place, staring at the small, undeniable proof that she wasn't alone, that she had never been alone. She forced herself to move. Slowly, carefully, she began searching the apartment, checking every door, every lock, every window. Nothing was broken, nothing forced open. But something was wrong. That's when she saw it. Another hole in the wall. This one was in the bathroom, just above the shower. The sight of it made her stomach churn. It was positioned perfectly, not at random, not accidental, but intentional. It pointed directly at the shower head, the exact spot she stood every morning. The breath left her lungs in a sharp, panicked exhale. She needed to know. With shaking hands, she grabbed her phone and shone the flashlight into the hole. The beam of light disappeared into the darkness beyond, illuminating a narrow gap in the walls. The air inside was thick with dust, the space barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Her stomach clenched as she thought about how long it had been there, how many showers she had taken, completely unaware that someone could have been watching. Her mind raced, trying to piece it together. The noises, the movements, the smell that never went away. And then she remembered the hallway closet. She had barely paid it any attention before, treating it as little more than a place to store coats and old boxes. But now, standing in front of it, she noticed something she had never seen before. The back panel didn't match the rest of the closet. It was a different shade, just slightly, the paint uneven, that would not quite flush with the surrounding walls. It looked like it had been removed and put back. Many times, her pulse thundered in her ears as she reached forward, pressing her fingers against the panel. It shifted under her touch. Loose. She dug her nails into the edges and pulled. The panel came away with a soft groan of wood against nails, revealing a hidden crawl space behind it. The air that seeped out was stagnant, thick with the unmistakable scent of sweat and something else, something rancid. And then she saw it. A makeshift bedding area, old blankets piled in the corner, flattened and stained. Empty food wrappers scattered across the floor. A notebook, its pages warped and curling at the edges. And a small hole in the drywall. Perfectly positioned. The notebook trembled in her hands as she flipped through its pages. The handwriting was cramped, hurried, the ink smudged in places where a hand had lingered too long. It wasn't just notes, it was an obsession laid bare, an account of her life written by someone who had been watching. Every detail was there. The time she left for work each morning, the route she took when she walked to the grocery store, the way she always checked the stove twice before leaving the apartment, the way she curled up on the couch at night, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, scrolling mindlessly through her phone before bed. She could see herself in those words, see the tiny, unnoticed moments of her day reflected back at her in jagged, uneven script. She had never felt so exposed. Her breathing turned shallow as she flipped further, scanning the pages with growing horror. The notes grew more personal. She likes to read before bed. Sometimes she cries. I wish I could comfort her. Her stomach twisted. She tried to remember the last time she had cried before falling asleep. A few nights ago, maybe? She had been feeling lonely. But no one should have known that. No one should have seen. Her hands shook as she turned to the most recent entries. I can't wait much longer. She's so close. A sharp, nauseating wave of fear rolled through her. She was close to what? The notebook felt like it was burning her fingers, but she couldn't stop. She needed to know how deep this went, how long this had been happening. And then she found it, tucked between two pages, as if it had been left there for her to find. A Polaroid. Her own face stared back at her. The photo was grainy, the edges worn, but there was no mistaking it. It was her, asleep, curled on her side, one arm tucked beneath the pillow, the blanket pulled up to her chest. The perspective was all wrong. It wasn't taken from the doorway, not from the window, either. It was taken from inside the walls. The blood in her veins turned to ice. She tore through the rest of the notebook, desperate for anything else, but she didn't need more. This was enough, more than enough. The world felt warped around her, bending at the edges like something in a nightmare. The apartment that had once felt so small now seemed vast and open, full of unseen spaces, hidden corners where someone, something, could be waiting. She needed help. Now. She grabbed her phone with numb fingers, her body moving on autopilot, driven by the raw animal instinct to survive. She opened the dial pad, pressed the first number, and then she heard it, a slow, deliberate creak from the bedroom, not from the walls, from inside the room. She wasn't alone. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. The notebook fell from her hands, pages fluttering as it hit the floor. The photo landed beside it, her own sleeping face staring up at the ceiling. She turned and ran. The front door was just a few feet away, but the distance felt infinite. Her fingers fumbled at the lock, shaking so badly she could barely grasp it. She yanked at the handle, expecting it to swing open. It didn't. The chain. Her breath hitched. She never used a chain. She never locked it from the inside. Her pulse pounded as she reached up, desperately clawing at the metal latch. She had to get out. Then footsteps. Slow. Measured. Not hurried, not panicked. Somewhere behind her, a whisper curled through the air. Don't go. The breath froze in her lungs. She turned, expecting to see someone standing there. But the apartment was empty. The air itself felt heavier, thick with something unseen. Then movement. A shift in the shadows near the closet. And a hand. It was there only for a second. Pale fingers too long, too thin, before it disappeared, slipping back into the crawl space. She didn't stop to think, didn't stop to breathe. She ripped the chain free, flung open the door, and ran. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by flickering bulbs overhead. The sound of her own heartbeat roared in her ears. She sprinted past the vacant apartments, past the dust-coated doors and dead-bolted locks. She didn't stop until she reached the lobby, where the security desk sat empty except for a blinking monitor. She slammed her hand against the desk, barely aware of the voice calling her name. Then the police arrived. They searched the apartment thoroughly, moving through each room with practiced efficiency. She stood in the hallway, arms wrapped around herself, watching as they disappeared inside. Minutes passed. Then, one by one, they came back out. They found nothing. The crawl space was empty. No bedding, no wrappers, no journal. She felt the world tilt around her, like she was standing on the edge of something vast and bottomless. She tried to protest, to explain, but the officers only exchanged glances. Pity softened their expressions. They asked if she had been under stress, if she had been sleeping. She wanted to scream. One officer hesitated before leaving, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. His voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. It's an old building. Weird things happen sometimes. But if you really feel unsafe, maybe find somewhere else to stay. Then they were gone. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay in bed with the lights on, knees pulled to her chest, phone clutched tightly in her hand. The apartment was silent now, oppressively still. The hole in the wall by her bed seemed darker than before, an empty void swallowing the light. The minutes crawled by. The city outside carried on, oblivious to the terror that had taken root inside her walls. Then her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. She stared at the screen, stomach twisting as she opened it. A photo of her, sleeping, taken from inside the walls. She wasn't staying. Not another night. Not another hour. The message on her phone burned into her vision, the image of her sleeping face twisting her stomach into knots. It wasn't possible. The police had searched everything. They had torn through the crawl space, found nothing. But someone had taken that photo. Someone was still inside. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She grabbed the nearest bag and started packing, shoving clothes into it with frantic hands. She didn't care what she took. She didn't care if she left everything behind. The only thing that mattered was getting out. The walls felt closer than before, suffocating, pressing in on all sides. Every sound made her jump. The creak of the floorboards, the wind rattling the windows, the faint hum of the refrigerator. The apartment was watching her. She could feel it. She turned to grab her last bag, the one tucked behind her bed. But something made her stop. A shift in the air, a feeling heavy and wrong, pooling at the back of her skull. The hole in the wall. It wasn't the same. It was bigger now. Not just slightly, not just a few centimeters wider from the pressure of age or decay. It was gaping, a jagged, open wound in the plaster. Large enough for something to be looking through. Large enough for something to crawl through. The breath caught in her throat as she stepped back, her legs weak beneath her. The darkness inside the hole was absolute, deeper than shadow, as if it didn't just lead into the walls but somewhere else entirely. She thought she saw movement, the faintest suggestion of fingers curling around the edges of the opening, slow and patient. She turned, running for the door, but something was wrong. The hallway was gone. The door wasn't there. The walls had shifted. The apartment was different now, reshaped around her. The entryway no longer led to the hall. The kitchen was no longer on her left. The walls weren't where they had been just minutes ago. They had closed in, sealed her inside. Not the walls, the crawl spaces, the hidden passages, the places she had never been able to see, the spaces she had never known existed, now swallowing the apartment piece by piece. She wasn't in a home. She was in a trap. A maze design around her reshaped the moment she tried to leave. The whisper came from everywhere. From nowhere. You were never alone. Darkness swallowed the room as the walls closed in.